Thanks for joining us.
America's News Headquarters starts right now.
Great job. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jenna. Fox News Alert Now. Good day. Along with Alisyn, Camerota, I'm Bill Hemmer. We are waiting on the president to make a statement on Ukraine in a matter of moments.
Chris Wallace is joining us now, perhaps to preview what he thinks the president will be saying. We've just learned of this announcement of a press conference. What do we know, Chris?
Well, I heard about it when you heard about it. I really don't know. The White House has announced some individual actions late yesterday that they are taking against individuals both in Ukraine and in Russia who they feel have contributed to the tensions there. So one assumes he's going to talk about the diplomatic path and what the U.S. intends to continue to do to keep the pressure on Putin and the Russians to try to get them, first of all, not to expand their presence in eastern Ukraine, and then secondly, to try to pull out of Crimea.
So we've heard, as you just said, that there will be these new visa restrictions on Russians as well as economic sanctions. Do we know what these look like?
Yeah, I mean, the visa restrictions are individual restrictions on people who, in either Russia or Ukrainian officials, they feel have contributed to the Russian occupation of Crimea. The economic sanctions, that I'm not so sure about. And, you know, there has been something of a split with the European Union because the U.S. is more aggressive about wanting to impose sanctions than the Europeans are, maybe because of the fact that we don't have much trade with Russia and the Europeans do. So they're somewhat more concerned. And another thing that you want to hear from is that the U.S. has been talking about sending some of its Air Force to other countries, not to the Ukraine, but to other countries that are right on the border with Russia, the Baltic nations, for instance, to make it harder, or at least to send a message to Moscow that if you in any way try to advance on other countries that are on your border, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be as easy as it was in Crimea.
Chris, the fact that we're seeing this hastily arranged press conference where the president we expect to come out in a couple of minutes, does this mean that they think that Putin is upping the ante? Does it mean the situation is getting hotter?
I mean, you can speculate about all kinds of things, whether they have an agreement with the Russians, whether, you know, they think Putin is about to do something and they want to head him off. I find in these cases, particularly where I don't know, the best thing to do is just wait and watch.
Yeah. that would be a great idea, Chris, except that leaves dead air time, which we cannot have on our program. But let's talk about what the thinking has been in the past 24 to 48 hours out of the White House. It appears that they think that Putin is operating in some sort of parallel universe where they're not telling the truth about what's going on in Crimea. They're not telling the truth about the Ukraine. What do they think their next ploy could be?
Well, it's interesting. I've heard two analyses of this recently, Alisyn, and one is that, you know, this is just what dictators do. They lie, and, you know, they not that it's a parallel universe, but they simply will say things that aren't so because it's inconvenient to say what is so. And so, for instance, they talk about, well, we're going into Crimea, or there is a threat to ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, and we're not really there as a matter of aggression. We're there to defend our countrymen. There's another set of analysis, though, that I think is worth talking about. I've heard some people in the intelligence community question whether Putin, in fact, is stable and whether or not, in fact, that there is some issue there. And that might perhaps explain why President Obama has been somewhat cautious in confronting Putin, because of a feeling that he might set him off in some kind of heightened and overreaction. So, you know, if you feel that you're dealing with somebody who might be a little bit unstable, that would constrain what you can say and do.
Okay, Chris Wallace, thanks so much for joining us to help preview this. We've just been given the 2-minute warning. Chris, thanks for your insight.
You bet.
From Chris Wallace now to Ed Henry live at the White House as well. Ed, good day to you. We know that President Obama and Putin spoke on Saturday for 90 minutes. What sort of contact have they had since then?
Well, they've had no contact since then. Bottom line is, my suspicion is the president wants to get out here because Republicans have been battering him, saying he hasn't been tough enough to calm the situation down. But people here inside the White House believe the situation actually is calming down because of the work the president's been doing with allies like Prime Minister Cameron in Britain and Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, who's been a key link here to the Russians. Bottom line is, they believe inside the White House that Putin is not, they won't use the word unstable, as was just mentioned, but they'll say he's isolated. He's feeling the heat right now. He's feeling pressure, and they also feel that the economy in Russia has taken such a hit. The ruble dropping to such a low level, the stock market in Russia taking a hit, that there's enormous pressure on Vladimir Putin to calm the situation down. And I bet the president wants to do that a little bit more right now.
Thank you, Ed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before Jay takes some of your questions, I want to provide a brief update on our efforts to address the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Since the Russian intervention, we've been mobilizing the international community to condemn this violation of international law and to support the people and government of Ukraine. This morning, I signed an executive order that authorizes sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, or for stealing the assets of the Ukrainian people. According to my guidance, the State Department has also put in place restrictions on the travel of certain individuals and officials. These decisions continue our efforts to impose a cost on Russia and those responsible for the situation in Crimea. And they also give us the flexibility to adjust our response going forward based on Russia's actions. We took these steps in close coordination with our European allies. I've spoken to several of our closest friends around the world, and I'm pleased that our international unity is on display at this important moment. Already we've moved together to announce substantial assistance for the government in Kiev, and today in Brussels, our allies took similar steps to impose costs on Russia. I am confident that we are moving forward together, united in our determination to oppose actions that violate international law, and to support the government and people of Ukraine. And that includes standing up for the principle of state sovereignty. The proposed referendum on the future of Crimea would violate the Ukrainian Constitution and violate international law. Any discussion about the future of Ukraine must include the legitimate government of Ukraine. In 2014, we are well beyond the days when borders can be redrawn over the heads of democratic leaders. While we take these steps, I want to be clear that there is also a way to resolve this crisis that respects the interests of the Russian Federation, as well as the Ukrainian people. Let international monitors into all of Ukraine, including Crimea, to ensure the rights of all Ukrainians are being respected, including ethnic Russians. Begin consultations between the government of Russia and Ukraine with the participation of the international community. Russia would maintain its basing rights in Crimea, provided that it abides by its agreements and respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And the world should support the people of Ukraine as they move to elections in May. That's the path of de-escalation. And Secretary Kerry is engaged in discussions with all of the relevant parties, including Russia and Ukraine, to pursue that path. But if this violation of international law continues, the resolve of the United States and our allies and the international community will remain firm. Meanwhile, we've taken steps to reaffirm our commitment to the security and democracy of our allies in Eastern Europe and to support the people of Ukraine. One last point. There's been a lot of talk in Congress about these issues. Today, once again, I'm calling on Congress to follow up on these words with action, specifically to support the IMF's capacity to lend resources to Ukraine and to provide American assistance for the Ukrainian government so that they can weather this storm and stabilize their economy, make needed reforms, deliver for their people, all of which will provide a smoother pathway for the elections that have already been scheduled in May. Today, the world can see that the United States is united with our allies and partners in upholding international law and pursuing a just outcome that advances global security and the future that the Ukrainian people deserve. That's what we're going to continue to do in the days to come until we have seen a resolution to this crisis. Thanks very much, and Jay and Ben and others will be happy to take your questions.
Do you think as unstable this to Vladimir Putin directly? Putin listening to you, sir?
So no questions there at the end. A brief statement, 3 minutes. Jay Carney now will continue the briefing there with reporters, and when it is relevant, we'll take you back in there. The president calls this a Russian intervention, insisting that any vote in the Crimea on behalf of the parliament there would be a violation of international law, and any decision made there would have to include the approval of the international community. And he also talked about substantial assistance going to support Kiev and impose a cost on Russia. A clear indication that this administration believes that the sanctions now are working and they're hurting Vladimir Putin and Russia. And for more from what's happening on the ground, Alisyn has that.
Fox's Shepard Smith is live for us in Ukraine. Let's go out to Shepard and find out what is the situation at this hour, Shep.
Well, Alisyn, we reported earlier that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was barred from entering Crimea earlier today. That organization, though not very familiar within the United States, is very familiar over here, and it was seen as a sort of way out, an opt-out for the Russian President Vladimir Putin if he chose to use it. But they were barred from entering Crimea. So you heard the President reiterate there, international monitoring organizations should be allowed in. He mentioned this vote from the vote from the parliament, if you will, in Crimea. That vote set up a referendum on the 16th of this month that would allow the people to decide of Crimea whether they want to be part of Russia or instead part of Ukraine. That vote is said to be illegitimate, yet it is, for the moment at least, said to go forward. So a lot of competing interests here, and most notably I thought today the interim prime minister of Ukraine came to the microphone and gave some of the strongest rhetoric that we've heard thus far, asking what is up with the rest of the world. How is it possible that a nuclear nation can invade, as he put it, a sovereign nation and not have to pay the price in any way? Now it appears that the president is beginning to put in place some sanctions, ones that he says are working, but so far not a lot of cooperation from European nations, and whether they'll sign off to sanctions really remains the untold so far, Bill and Allie.
Shepard, how closely are people in Ukraine where you are watching and listening to what President Obama or Secretary Kerry are saying?
I think they're watching what all of Europe and all of the West, including the United States, are having to say now. They're in a very precarious position. They know that their neighbors to the south in Crimea now no longer have any access to Ukrainian television. Every Ukrainian channel that you watch now has the Ukrainian flag in the upper left-hand side of the screen and says in Ukrainian, Ukraine United. Well, those channels were blocked beginning today in Crimea, and all they get now is Russian state television, which is classic Putin control the message. The message coming from Russian state television is very different from anything you hear here in Kiev, and certainly different, as we've observed, from the facts on the ground. So this manipulating the message and the minds of those who are receiving it is something that Putin is now doing in Crimea. There's a concern here in Kiev, in the center of the Ukrainian government, that as the message gets diluted, that in fact this split could become larger. And the biggest concern, Alisyn, as you know, is that this will move to another phase. The Ukrainian government was today commended for its restraint by the European Union when it comes to fighting back against Russia. But that interim prime minister says, in the spirit of revolution, the Ukrainian people will unite, and though our military is inferior to that of Russia, we will stand up and fight if it comes to that. If it does come to that, the world has a new problem.
Shepard, it is great to have you give us all of the latest breaking information, and we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock for your show. Thank you.
If this violation continues, the resolve of the U.S. and international community will remain firm. Those words from the president. How will they react if it does continue? Ralph Peters, the colonel, on that, next.
As